place to store my crops. Then he said, I'll do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have been ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, these goods laid up for many years, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. The gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Don't be so greedy. Sometimes the messages of Scripture are kind of hard to understand, to discern, to make sense of. We have to really wrestle with the fact that these words come from 2,000 or more years ago. How do we make sense of all this? Sometimes those are hard to figure out. Sometimes they seem as if they could have been written today. If you've got stuff that's been sitting around and you haven't used it in the last year, get rid of it. That's what my wife says. If the stuff you have doesn't give you joy, get rid of it. That's what the great consultants say. All that stuff. If you have to get a storage unit to take care of your stuff, isn't that really surplus? Do you really need it? What else could you be doing with it? That seems to be a pretty straightforward kind of message. The question really seems to be, and this underlying that is, not how much do you have for yourself, but how generous are you with what you have? Are you really making the best use of that? Because at any time, all that stuff will have little meaning. All will be vanity, Ecclesiastes says. If you don't make good use of that, if you aren't able to really see some fulfillment in what those things give you, seems pretty clear. But like often in Scripture, especially in more recent years, we're also realizing there's usually some deeper message. The Gospels often tell us basic kind of stories, but there's something deeper usually, something that says, we got to look at this a little more carefully. Most often we look at it in terms of justice issues. What are the justice themes that stand out here? Isn't there an injustice when some have so much more than they need? In this story, the man has a lot of stuff, apparently. His new storage facilities will handle more than just this food that he had an abundant crop from. He will have other stuff stored in there. Why should some have so much more than they need and others have so much less? What's the injustice in all that? And how do we equal the playing field? How does it work that some of this can be redistributed? Is it enough for us who probably have much more than we need, just give a little bit of our surplus to others, and if we've given some things away, we can feel good, even if it isn't anywhere near to the need or the demands of people who for whatever reason are in great need. Justice goes beyond just a little bit of charity. And whose responsibility is that to make sure that there is some equal distribution, some good sharing, so that there are none in need, as the Bible often is eager to say. And they work in the Bible to say, let's redistribute things more. Is that the role of government? How do we recognize that need of how that redistribution takes place? All these things are issues we struggle with. What was God's intention in creating a world in which we're all somehow related? Isn't that the basic story of creation? We all come from a common creation that God has provided. Justice for all, we say in our pledge. Do we really believe that? Jesus has a lot to say in the Scripture, especially in the Gospel of Luke, about how wealth can lead away from generosity. Wealth is a big problem in Scripture. Leads to the kind of greed, the more you have, the more you want. Remember the story from just a few weeks ago. Jesus talks to the rich man. He says, I've tried to do everything I can. I try to live up to the law. I've tried to do it as intentionally and as purposefully as I can. What else is there for me to do? And Jesus says, give it all to the poor. Well, I don't know if I can do that, he seems to say. living up to the measure of justice and being truly compassionate are very hard words to hear, and remind us that we often fail in trying to measure up. We never can do quite enough. And we get into a bind of saying we still have issues of justice because it's so hard to work out all these things. But as if that isn't enough, it seems to me there's also a challenge that pushes us beyond this, and an issue that is even more pressing and perhaps more concern for us today, and that's not just the issue of justice, but what about eco-justice? What about the demands of the environment that seem to be impinging on us every more? And today we hear more and more about climate change, about the problems of various countries that are wrestling with inadequate ability to produce the crops they need for their people because of a changing climate. The problems that are all around us. How do we deal with those kind of changing problems that are so critical for our life today? That's why I'll change my stole for a minute. It's not just about green, the season of growth, the season of Pentecost we celebrate. But this is kind of my pet blessing stole, my animal stole. My biologist friend says it's all about biodiversity. If we're creating a world in which the diversity of species can't exist, what kind of world will that be anymore? How do we balance these challenges of the environment and of equal distribution when so many people are impacted by it all? My dad was he was a pastor, but he was also a great outdoorsman, as we call him. Any chance he had, he'd be outside. He didn't take much of an excuse. He'd be out in the woods. He'd be out in the wild somewhere, hunting, fishing, or just being out and about. Before the ice was even off the lakes back in Minnesota, he would be out there. He'd have our canoes and kayaks, and we'd be out in the water. We'd be there with little ice floes, little icebergs around us, kind of dodging them as we paddled around, being out in the water as early in spring as we could possibly be. Dad loved everything about being outside. But I don't think in all his years, at least as I can remember, he never really spoke about that love of nature or environmental concerns in his sermons. It's as if that wasn't the right place for all this kind of stuff, but that was a separate world. Now, granted, he retired in 1978. So at that point, there weren't a lot of people talking much about environmental perils. I think the first Earth Day was in 1970. But still, there was not a lot of awareness, and people weren't really tuned in. I would bet many of us were not thinking or talking about it. We kind of took nature for granted. It's God's abundant gift to us. We celebrate it, but we don't really need to reflect or talk much about it other than to be thankful for good weather and nice harvests. We all have a difficulty in understanding how best to come to grips with the realities of the environment, to learn to talk about it, to be more aware of what changes are happening around us and how we need to gear up in our response. How do we translate, just as my dad, even though he had a love for creation, how does he translate that into a real motivation to change, to be more responsive, to be more attentive to the things that we need to do to reduce our carbon footprint, to seek policies that can change our wasteful ways? We need to talk about it and consider how and what action is required. How are we going to vote about this in the coming elections next year? Who will best represent the kind of dire situation we face? Can we consider that God has made us all wealthy like this rich man? Wealthy in the things of nature, in all the gifts and beauty and wonder that surround us. And that we can't just try to keep it for ourselves or hold on to our little piece of the creation that gives us great comfort and joy. But that somehow we need to realize how it is that we can make it work for all, how all can come to be recipients of this great and abundant creation. Maybe the flip side of being so greedy is to be so wasteful, to have all this stuff and just waste it, to use our fossil fuels in ways that aren't really realizing the impact they have, and how easy it is to waste that gift of creation. The man in our story is not just selfish, but he's unfulfilled. What good does it do him to have so much stuff, more than he actually needs? Can we find fulfillment in our efforts to try to take on issues of environmental stewardship, of caring for God's creation, and realizing in that process, even if it means changes, more conservative changes in our lifestyle, to find that kind of fulfillment God would offer, to bring us closer to God in the way in which we deal with these issues? I've long held to an idea, or a psychology really, that life is about balancing our need for security and our need for growth. If green represents the season of Pentecost, the season of growth, how do we balance that with our need to also be more conservative and aware of our need for security in the world around us? My youngest granddaughter had just been walking for a few months now. You see it very clearly. She will take some tentative steps and realize, hey, this isn't so bad. But then she'll start to wobble a little bit and have to grab for somebody's knees or for a coffee table to get some security back. But once you got the security, that's not enough. Pretty soon you have to grow again. You have to be venturing out a little bit more, because life is all about adventure. Balancing growth and security. Realizing that the earth provides us our basic security, our existential security. But what does growth mean if we're not just consuming ever more and more, or using up the resources that are truly limited? How do we grow in an environment where we need to also be aware of this earthly security? Those are the challenges we face. Jesus was very intent in the Gospel of Luke to seek and to save the lost. He was constantly reaching out for people who were about to fall off the edge and be lost because they were marginalized or hungry, or people without the capacity to care for themselves. Jesus wanted to seek them out continually and help rescue them. His mission was clear. Seems to me we too must dedicate ourselves to the unselfish, ungreedy job of sharing and serving and enriching others, being more mindful of the challenges to greater security in our world, or greater justice in our world, while also serving our planet and seeking the welfare of all. We're in this together. We need to find ways of making sure that justice is done throughout our world, not just in our own neighborhoods. With God's help, with the effort to balance our need for growth and security, we will find greater fulfillment. God will be with us in the challenge. Let us always be hopeful. Let us always be mindful of how God continues to work in the creation God gave us.